inequalities that exist in society, and people start to be very concerned about that. And of course, fast forwarding, in many ways, we're actually facing also a time when economic deprivation and economic downturn has made really salient issues of economic inequality. This is Oxfam 2016. Actually, the recent report is showing very similar figures that the wealth of the world is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. And perhaps inequality was always there, but it's probably the global financial crisis that made us aware of the issue and made us concerned about it and seeing it as something that is unjust. There's another trend that I find very interesting in this regard too. This is Ipsos data. It's 22 countries. And they were actually asked, people in these countries were asked, question 10, to fix this country, my country, we need a strong leader willing to break the rules. And what I find quite, well, dramatic about this is that a total of 49% of people either tended to agree or strongly agreed with that statement. And you can see that there is, of course, variation. The strongest agreement is in France, and then followed by Israel, Italy, and the lowest by Sweden and Germany. But again, this is quite interesting. Such a high endorsement of leaders who are willing to sort of do things, be the strong leader, even if that means achieving things through undemocratic means or breaking rules that we value in society. So the question then is a very simple one that we asked in our research. Is it the case that these perceptions of economic inequality or even objective levels of inequality, do they actually sort of fuel that desire for a strong leader? That's a hypothesis we wanted to test. Before I elaborate on that, we also thought a bit about why that would be, why you might actually expect those two variables to be related to each other. And we proposed that enemy could be an important mediator. So enemy is a concept that our PhD student, Ali Timori, he did quite a bit of work trying to take this sociological concept, taking it to social psychology and thinking a bit about how to measure it. And what we actually did in this work is we adopted a definition that Durkheim has sort of put forward, looking at enemy as social dysfunction, chaos in society, where everyone has the feeling that there are no moral guides anymore. So prediction here would be that what high inequality does is that it triggers feelings of enemy. If we feel that there's, this big gap between the poor and the wealthy, we also feel that there are greater us-them distinctions. It leads to fragmentation of society, undermines social fabric. We feel that there's more chaos in society. And to really deal with that chaos, we actually want a strong leader, someone who can. So just to give you a little bit of the empirical evidence we have for this. The first study was a study where we actually felt we had all of the data that allowed us to test this pathway. We had more than 6,000 undergraduate students from 28 countries, and it was really just collaborators in all of these 28 countries who had tested data. They came from every continent. And this is in addition to the Gini coefficient for each of these 28 countries, right? The Gini coefficients that can vary from 0 to 1 tells you a little bit about how unequal the distribution of wealth is in a country. And that is a statistic that's released by the World Bank. But in addition to that, we also wanted to create our own Gini coefficients. And we did that by asking participants to consider 100 people in their country and to simply indicate how many of those would be very poor, average in wealth, wealthy to very wealthy, and that had to add up to 100. Yeah? So you get a distribution. This is over all of those 28 countries. You can see that what is often found in the literature is that people grossly underestimate inequality as it exists. But for us, what was more important was that on the left-hand side, you can see the Gini coefficient as it is calculated by the World Bank, which is really just the line of equality where everyone has the same, which is sort of, and the distance is calculated from the Lorentz curve, which is the actual distribution. And on the right-hand side, some clever PhD students that I'm fortunate to work with worked out how to actually do that, measure calculate the Gini coefficient for that measure that I just showed you. So when we then have for these 28 countries is the actual Gini coefficient and the perceived Gini coefficient, right? How unequal people think their country is. As you can see here, the first thing to notice is indeed for all of the countries that actual inequality is higher than perceived inequality, but you also can see that there is variation there. For us, what was important is that there was a nice correlation between the two. It was so there it is grounded in some reality, but it's also not too high, right? Okay, so we also measured anomie, this measure that our student Ali Timori developed, which is really tapping different aspects of anomie, the breakdown of social fabric, breakdown of government. And we measured a wish for a strong leader with 3 items. Our country needs a strong leader right now. We need strong leadership in order to make this society survive. And we need strong leadership in order to overcome society's difficulties. And we controlled for a lot of things that could, of course, co-vary with these relationships. So what we found was, as you can see at the top, objective inequality was indeed correlated with a wish for a strong leader. So the higher the Gini coefficient, the more that people said they wanted a strong leader. But importantly, we also have an effect that subjective inequality, the more we think collectively that society is becoming more unequal, that led to higher perceptions of anomie, which also led to a stronger wish for a strong leader. Yeah. So we have some evidence there, and I think it's nice that it's both objective and also subjective inequality that is predicting our outcome in this case. Okay, we felt that maybe we should try and replicate this. We had an Australian community sample. It's not quite representative, but it's more representative sample than what we had in our first study. So we again measured subjective inequality, anomie, wish for a strong leader with the same items as we used before, but because we also really wanted to get much more at this idea that support for an undemocratic authoritarian leader, we added 4 items that tap that a bit more specifically, I think. So the question was, Australia needs a strong leader who's willing to challenge democratic values and practices, who's willing to break the rules, who wants to change the status quo, and who keeps tight control over the country's decisions and activities. Yeah, all these things that basically sort of imply erosion of democracy. Our correlations show that the variables correlate in ways that we predicted. But let me just show you the mediational pattern where we replicate our previous effect, that the more that people perceive there to be inequality, and that is that same measure that I talked about, the 100 people in your country, the more that they felt that there's inequality, that led to greater perceptions of anomie, of chaos in Australia, and that then predicts a wish for a strong leader. Yeah. But of course, with this one, we replicate the effect, but it's still not causal evidence, right? Is it perhaps that, you know, if I want a strong leader, that I justify that by saying, yeah, but we got some problems to fix, right? So that could well be possible. So what we did in 2 more studies, we introduced an experimental design. And let me just walk you through that. We had 2 conditions. We had a condition of low inequality and high inequality. And what we did when our participants came to the lab or for our M-Turkers, we actually told them that you're going to join this hypothetical society called Bimbola. And Bimbola, like any sort of society, has rich, poor people. And they either saw the left or the right-hand sort of distribution of resources in Bimbola. And as you can see on the left, low inequality, you can see that the gap between the different wealth groups is quite small in what their income is, where it's much higher in a high economic inequality condition. Importantly, all our participants were then randomly allocated to income group 2. Yeah, so all of them are told that your income is going to be 40,000. Yeah. What we did then, just to bring that to life a bit, we said, look, you have to start your life in Bimbola, and to do that, you need a house. So because you're an income group 2, these are the 3 houses that you can sort of pick from. And you can see they're sort of average. They're not great, but they're not, unpleasant either. In the low economic inequality, people saw this for the richest group, group number 1 and group number 3, what they could buy. And you can see it's the income, the differences are not that stark. But compare and contrast that to what we showed them in the high inequality condition, you can see that income group 1 is living in mansions and income group 3 is really in this very poor housing conditions. We did the same for cars. So in the low economic inequality, you can see that the differences between what people can afford in the different income groups is not that large, but it becomes much larger in a high economic inequality condition. And then we also told people, in terms of holidays, what you can afford. This is one of the 3 pick from that. And low economic inequality, it's everyone can go on a holiday, but it can vary. Either you go camping or, so it's all somewhat, it's not all that different, but of course that's very different in a high economic inequality condition. If you are in income group 3, you simply can't afford a holiday, but in income group 1, we told people that they can go on a space trip and they go to the private island. So it's really to just make that clear. Even though all of this is, of course, hypothetical, it seemed to work. Our manipulation checks show that people get what you're trying to do and they sign up to it. But importantly for us was, of course, if we ask them people in Bimbola, to what extent do you see that there's enemy? To what extent there's there chaos in society? In the high inequality condition, they felt that there's more of that than in the low inequality condition. And also, we found the same pattern for wish for a strong leader, which is higher in the high inequality than the low inequality condition. And again, looking at mediational patterns, you can see that we replicated that. So in a high inequality condition, people perceive there to be more enemy, and that is associated with a wish for a strong leader. Well, we submitted that, and then our reviewers told us, you need to replicate this, you need to pre-register this. And so I just want to show that this is the second study we ran. We replicated the effect, and we also found further evidence for that mediational pattern that we showed you. So there's some confidence on our part that it seems to be a robust effect. Okay, so just to wrap up, the first point I want to mention really is that I think that perceptions of inequality is often something that we're not really looking at all that much. There's really an emphasis on, is it objectively, is there inequality or not? But I think these perceptions of inequality are just as important as objective indicators. And that is precisely because of issues. If we want to understand why people feel that they're being treated unfairly when they're willing to do something about it, willingness to take collective action or support for a strong leader, it is these perceptions that are collectively shared often that seem to drive that, not so much whether the World Bank tells us that inequality has again gone up. So I think we do need to understand the psychology here just as much as the actual reality. And I think also, there's more and more literature on the negative effects of inequality. And I think what we actually see here is maybe a demonstration that it is also related to perhaps the surge in populism that we're seeing at this moment. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in understanding that relationship better. And this is, of course, particularly important in the light of what we see happening around us in a very turbulent political landscape that we see here in the US, but also all around the world, Europe, Asia, etc. So what I would like to do is just to finish with a quote that Hannah Arendt actually published, well, you know, this was just after the Second World War, which is very relevant, I guess, to what I talk about. So Hannah Arendt was very much sort of theorizing on how the state of the economy and what is happening economically, how that can help us to understand the rise of populism or even you know, fascist regimes. And the point that she makes here is that, well, if you actually live in a world that is changing, that becomes incomprehensible, right, where there is chaos, then you have actually a fertile ground for leaders to come in who tell us how we should see that world, right? So, and at the very end, I think she makes a very good point. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie, and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. So interestingly, what Hannah Arendt, for instance, is saying is that what populist leaders do is, on the one hand, they make us believe that the world is broken, that the social fabric is breaking down, but also then use that to position themselves as the solution to that breakdown. And of course, interestingly, Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, was a book that became very popular after the election of Donald Trump, even to the extent that Amazon ran out of stock for a little while because they couldn't meet demand. I'd like to leave it there, but finally, I really want to thank all the other people that worked with me on this project, in particular Stefanie Sprong, who's now a PhD student at Trinity College. And of course, also this paper has a very long list of co-authors because all of the people who contributed data to the first study are also included. Thank you. I'd like to leave it there.
Probably take one or maximum two questions, and I'd just like to invite Chris to come up and put your slides up while we're having those questions. Or Jolanda, why don't you pick? Sorry.
Yeah. I'm just interested in what do you think the role of either meritocracy beliefs or system justification is in related to anomie? Like you would think,
yeah.
if you're higher in those belief, like social dominance orientation, or things that where you say that it's just to have winners and losers, that anomie in the face of inequality would be lower.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, in a paper a theoretical paper we did on anomie, which appeared in Political Psychology, we're actually making the point that anomie is perhaps different from anything we ever theorized, because to believe in a just world, you have to have a system in place where there is clearly people who are at the top and at the bottom. The more that you have anomie, the more that people are actually no longer understanding who's at the top of the bottom. So actually, so system justification may apply in a stable world, but actually the more that there's instability, the more that you that's anomie is really the confusion that arises out of that. And the other point I would like to make, I think that what populism really is a quest for change, right? This is also what we see here. It's not justifying the status quo. It is really about, no, we're actually not happy with how things are. We want change, right? And that can perhaps be from those at the top as well as at the bottom. In our data, for instance, we controlled for their own personal financial situation and political orientation. So it's no longer sort of the sort of, yeah, it's I think, yeah, anyway, I hope that I could talk on for hours, but I just yeah. I don't know who.
One very quick question.
Okay, I would just question, how would including racial resentment complicate how would including racial resentment change your findings in terms of anomie?
Racial resentment?
Yes.
Can you explore?
A serious model of symbolic racism, of just thinking about it in terms of some of this stuff around illiberalism. Some will argue it's more about threats to whiteness, that Turkey, part of it is Syrian refugees, Hungary, Erdogan's stance that it's immigration and hatred towards the other as being not so much for you. I would say that that enemy may serve as a proxy for chaos of others coming into the country. And,
Yeah, I get your point. And of course, there's also a correlation here between inequality and opposition to immigration. We found that in that data set too. I think it's a separate sort of phenomena though, because what we did here too is look at whether that is an additional variable. Is it really because of that, keeping immigrants out, that is driving the quest for strong leader? That's a part that you can explore, but that's separate from what I presented here today. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So our next speaker, obviously, Chris Crandall, and to give him maximum time, I'm just going to sit down now. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. I took some notes from Jolanda's talk, and what I think Jolanda said, you didn't know I was going to be here discussing, that what she's arguing that psychological processes, the individual psychological processes build up to contribute to socio-historical processes. It's a very simple argument, and I want to make the same argument as well, and I think that's actually the level at which we can contribute. We are psychologists, not sociologists, and the issue, of course, is what are the individual psychological processes that come together, that merge to create a fertile ground, or in my case, justify behaviors that would otherwise appear unjustifiable. And I took a look at the title of our session, and my research is, you know, MTurk people doing small experiments. Am I in the way? All right, thank you. Am I taller than Jolanda?
Yes.
Okay, that must be it. Okay, so, but extremism is seen from the outside. The people who are extremists don't believe that they're as extreme as we believe they are. Right? They may think that they're on the forefront, they're on the vanguard, they're advanced, but we see that same stuff as extremism. And inside, extremism is normalized, right? It's normalized by social norms, by cultural rules, by language, by justifications that make the extreme seem normal. And so what Jolanda has done, and what I want you to think about what I'm going to do, which is not as grand in its scope, is that we look at the normal processes that lead to normalize extremism and allow it to flourish. I was asked about my title, am I working to keep the social context? And the answer is no, but what I want to do is talk about how people can do that. And I want to sing, Jason Miller and Mark White worked on this with me, but Mark White is a very important player here and should be a speaker, but he's making a lot more money than me right now and busy at it. Okay, so you know, the question is, how do people fit into the world? And the answer is, well, they either fit or they don't. And if you don't fit into the world, then you have to change. And if you don't want to change, then you have to manage the discrepancies between how you feel, how you believe, what you want to do, and what the world accepts. And sometimes you don't fit into the world. Maybe you have more prejudice than is considered politically correct. And of course, politically correct simply means you don't want to let me say the things that I want to say. And so what you do is you try to manipulate the normative climate. You want to create a world where your beliefs, your values, your behaviors are acceptable. And one of the ways you can do that, I'm going to argue, is to say that when people say something that's racist or sexist or otherwise prejudiced that most people don't like, you can defend that speech by simply saying people are expressing or using their free speech rights. So when somebody says something horrible, you don't say, well, it's not horrible, it's just free speech, man. It's okay to say these things because that's an important value in America. The problem with that, of course, is that free speech, and often racist speech, is punished and often harshly. I know that most of us probably think there's too much of this speech going on, and that may be the case, but racist speech is often very harshly punished with disapprobation, with exclusion, and often with being fired. You say something on social media you think is fine because you're just saying what you believe, and that's all fine, and people lose their jobs. And what happens when people lose their jobs is other people join on the internet and say, hey man, they're just using their free speech rights. It's just fine. That's free speech and they ought to be able to do it. There's a subtlety here, of course, is that when you say there's a free speech right, most Americans in particular, Americans really love free speech. Most Americans are going to say, that's right, you do have free speech, but you're not free of consequences from that speech. And that consequences is elided in the free speech defense, which I'll tell you a little bit about. I'm going to try and see my own talk. So when people are fired for exercising their speech, it's going to have a chilling effect on the expression of prejudice. People are going to say, oh, I can't say that. But the freedom of speech defense, saying people are just exercising their rights, allows to justify it, and it unjustifies the firing. It reduces the penalty or the perceived penalty, or at least the legitimacy of the penalty for saying something racist. So we're interested in how freedom of speech justifies the expression of prejudice. In America, our data are collected mostly on MTurk. They're mostly Americans, a few slip through, but it's mostly Americans. And what you can find here is on a list of American values of freedoms, speech and religion, absolutely the top. This goes to the heart of what Americans think they're about. And furthermore, if you compare the United States to the rest of the world, we like to be able to publicly criticize government policies, say things that are offensive to other people's religions, say things that are offensive to minorities, sexually explicit. We are even more in favor of calling for violence than other countries. So we really love our free speech, and it's going to resonate to our audience. So you can think of these values as a justification. A justification is something that normalizes, allows, takeaways the sting, removes the guilt, delegitimizes punishment for an expression of prejudice. So a justification is anything that helps normalize or make acceptable the expression of prejudice. And what we think is that people are going to use the free speech defense mostly to the extent that they share those beliefs, right? If you are horrified by an expression of sexism or prejudice or anti-religious statement or whatever, then you are unlikely to defend that speech. But if you share it, you might want to come to its defense. And so we predicted that the free speech defense would be a nice marker for high levels of sharing that prejudice. Our first study we looked at, this came after a story, some fraternity boys were on a bus in Oklahoma and singing a song about the exclusion of Black people from their fraternity. The song is very offensive, and it was filmed by somebody who, by a female who was at the social event with them, and it went viral, and the two students were actually kicked out of the university without due process. They were kicked out by the president. And we ran our study the same week, having people read about the study and then ask them if they wanted to endorse the free speech defense. I show you our MTurk participants. These are typical of virtually all the studies we got here, mostly white, slightly more male than female, young middle age. And it turns out that none of the demographic issues matter very much for our effects. So do people endorse free speech values? It's a violation of their free speech to kick them off. They have a right to it. They shouldn't have been expelled. Universities being so harsh. And then we measured prejudice in a variety of different ways. Let me tell you that in our studies, it doesn't matter how you measure prejudice. The effects are similar no matter what the measurement. So we're measuring anti-Black sentiment, anti-African American sentiment. And what you find here is the more people score high in racial animus, the more they endorse the free speech defense, and the correlation is 47. And we were kind of thrilled by that because we were thinking maybe 25, but routinely these correlations are in the 40s. So they're pretty reliable, pretty strong effects. We've never failed to find the effect. So there's that. In this study, we controlled for social dominance orientation, politics, gender. It doesn't affect anything really substantially, and we do it a lot. And it never matters really. It's really a very close connection between the underlying attitude and the use of the justification. Now you might be wondering, well, maybe people who are high in racial prejudice are very deeply principled people, and they love free speech and they will defend free speech no matter what. And it just happens that you ask them something related and you don't know that, but you know, it seems kind of convenient. The justification comes after, the defense comes after the speech. We think it's a justification, but we haven't really showed it. And remember, the goal of the justification is to not feel guilt for expressing it or having it, to not feel shame, public shame, and to avoid punishment for self and others, presumably. And so what we wanted to do was look at this to see if it was justification as opposed to principled. So we have people get fired for anti-black speech and then anti-police speech, which is presumably not positively correlated with racism, or excuse me, it is possibly correlated with anti-black racism, but it's saying something against the police should work in the opposite order, direction here. So if it's principled, you'd expect to find a correlation between racial prejudice and free speech defense when it's anti-black speech and when it's anti-police speech, because if you're principled, you're not going to like it either way. That you're not going to like the suppression of speech either way. And so we have people read about a story about a guy who says some bad things, either about protesters who are black protesters, and he says something pretty offensive, or he says the exact same thing, but it's pretty offensive about the police. And the question is, how much does racial prejudice predict the defense of free speech? You see that here. And what you find here is the dotted line shows you a near perfect replication for anti-black speech here. And then no predictive value of prejudice for the anti-police speech, right? So that doesn't look principled. Also, you have to look at the graph and realize it's the people who are low in prejudice are actively avoiding the free speech defense. And I think what this tells you is that the high racist people recognize the value of the free speech defense, and the low racist speech recognize the value of the free speech defense as well and are running away from it. Why? We argue because it creates a climate that's tolerant of racist speech, and the anti-racists don't want that climate, and the high racists do want that climate. So we think people are knowledgeable about what they're doing. They know the implications of what they're doing. Here's the study again, same thing. We thought maybe using police was pushing the data a little too much. Maybe we're tipping the scales. So instead of being anti-police, you're pro-macaron. Okay. That's pretty much a control condition. And what do you find? You find basically the same thing, another replication of that, no predictive value in the macaron condition. People, I don't know who would be against macarons. I guess maybe if you hate diabetes or something. So again, the low prejudice people are against using the free speech defense because they understand what's going on. Okay. So there's a nice replication, but I need to tell you that you may not have recognized there's a weird thing going on. Somebody's getting fired, getting very punished, very badly punished for this behavior, and innocent bystanders are sticking their neck out defending them, right? This is somebody who society has decided is a loser and should be punished. And people are stepping in and saying, now, wait a minute here. I want to protect this poor fellow that you all hate. And so why are they doing that? Why would a person step in and do that? And our first thought was that maybe when somebody's beliefs are attacked that you share, you feel attacked yourself. And so you're protecting yourself by extension. And I'm getting the effect that I always get, which is a lot of people in the audience go, yeah, that sounds right. Let me just tell you, I'm going to skip this stuff. We did 3 studies, one where they do a self-affirmation exercise, so that should make them feel less threatened and not need to justify. We did had people be told they were high or low in prejudice, and in another study we had them manipulate their similarity to the racist person. So you know they had the same height, weight, birthday, interests and stuff. None of these things did anything at all. And so we have decided that it's probably not the threat to self that's what's going on. We actually believed it at the beginning. That's why we persisted through 3 studies. We never got a thing. We decided that we were proving the null as best we could. We had power and we got no evidence for it. So what does do it, and here you can see lots of people who are puzzled. It turns out that we have evidence, and I won't explain it at length because I have other things to tell you, but it turns out that people feel that they have a right, that their freedom to express is threatened. So when you take away people's freedom to express, this makes them want to do free speech. And we asked people, hey, was there a time when you couldn't be yourself, when you couldn't talk, when people made you shut up about things you believe? And then we asked them about free speech. And what you find is when people think about times they couldn't speak, they then really love free speech. So they're really saying, I need to find a space where I can say what I want to say, right? They're creating a normative climate. They want a climate that allows them to speak. We did the same thing using individual prejudice, our usual vignette. We ask about expressive threat. We replicate the basic finding. In a anti-coworker or anti-black speech. And the anti-coworker, it's marginally significant, although the interaction of the slopes is significant. We get the replication that the low people are running away from it. And here is, don't study this. It's just, I just wave my hands and say, moderated mediation, Yahoo, that's what we're looking for. And so it really is a sense of threat to the self, ability to speak, to have a climate that is welcoming to your speech that really matters. Okay. So you might think, if you're just being individual psychological, that a person is personally reserving their own freedom to express. It's a personal right. But we think that it's more social psychological. The person's affecting the normative climate. They're pushing back on anti-prejudice norms. It's a public right that they're protecting, right? To speak. So that was the first stop. The second stop is the notion of authenticity. And where am I on time? Because I am lost.
4 minutes to get to the 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So we thought that in the days of Donald Trump as the US president, that authenticity might be another way that people are manipulating the normative climate to allow the expression of prejudice. And the argument is a simple one, that when Donald Trump says horrible things, or other politicians say horrible things, it's defensible because they're just being their authentic self. They're just telling it like it is. They're just, not adapting their own speech to the politically correct climate that forces people to lie and look good. So they're not posers. And Sid Gerard was big on this, but that's just a name check. If you know Sid Gerard, you go, yeah, okay, and then all right. So Trump is using this or Trump's supporters are using this as a justification. They see that he's authentic. In the race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, does Donald Trump say what he believes? Is he authentic? And 70 to 80% of the people go, oh, man, that guy's authentic. What about Hillary Clinton? Is she honest? No. So Trump is seen as more honest than Hillary Clinton, which is a little odd given the data, but it's not about what the underlying honesty is, but it's the authenticity. They're really showing themselves. Okay. And we thought, I'm going to skip this because I've got better data. I don't have better data. We looked at people saying horrible things against Muslims, against politicians, or against good things. And this was people saying that the beach is horrible, ice cream is bad, and pizza tastes awful, right? Somebody saying that must be true because everybody loves those things, and if they don't say they don't like pizza, it must be true. So we looked at these things, and then people also said anti-Muslim or anti-politician stuff, and then they were rated for their authenticity. And the important thing is that when you say anti-Muslim stuff, you're seen as having authenticity in your statements about Muslims. When you say anti-politician things, you are seen as being authentic in your beliefs about politicians, but there's no crossover pathways, right? So there's no generic sense that saying bad things makes you authentic. And it turns out that the prediction of saying authentic is sharing the value, right? So authenticity, to make things really short, is a way of finding somebody who shares your values and they express them and you feel it's authentic. Now, we have experiments I'm not going to show you where we manipulate whether or not the norm is acceptable or unacceptable to say the prejudice. And it turns out that authenticity is perceived only when the subject shares the prejudice and that prejudice is counter-normative, right? So authenticity is perceived when somebody says something that I share that I'm not supposed to have, but I know that everybody else has it and they're just lying because it's all politically correct, right? There's a sense that it's unduly suppressed, and when somebody comes out with it, you say that's authentic, that's real. And I have 1 minute, and I want to show you, I got lots of stuff that says this, but I want to tell you one super new study that I got 1 minute to tell you about, and that is, if you use these justifications, do they affect the normative climate? I got the data last night, so please don't ask me any questions about it, but I have the means. The effects are not large, but they're interesting, I think. And what we did is we took a social media perception. Somebody says something horrible, and I'm going to show it to you, and then we have the moderators of that social media site come in and make a justification statement to allow that posting to stay up in the group. And it's a Star Wars group, and it's about The Last Jedi. And one notable thing about The Last Jedi is that the main character is female, right? Unlike all the other Star Wars. Star Wars has always had interesting female characters, but not the focal character. And this is a woman, and the person says, these so-called strong female characters only seem strong next to dumbed down males. Disney Star Wars is Marxist propaganda. Long live Western culture. Western culture is white, Christian, and patriarchal. Those of you on the web, please don't edit this as my personal statement, because yeah. So that's offensive. That's a real statement, of course, taken from a site. And the moderators either say it's going to stay up, the control condition, or this person is authentically stating their beliefs and we're going to let it stay up because of its authenticity, or that person's just expressing their free speech rights. And then our participants rated how acceptable is it to leave these things up, and the defense speeches marginally raise it. These are not big effects, but they are real effects. And how many people agree in the group actually tend to agree with this horrible patriarchal white Christian statement. And in the free speech case in particular, people are seen as more agreeing. So here is our first little whiff of evidence that these defenses do have an effect on the perceived normative climate for acceptability. So what do the data mean? Free speech and authenticity can justify prejudice. They justify it particularly by people who share those prejudices. People step in and justify other people's racial misconduct, which is odd because presumably they're stepping right into the firing line that just got somebody literally fired. And why are they doing it? They're doing it, we think, to keep a place that's free and open for expression, and free and open expression in particular for very disagreeable kinds of racist or sexist sentiments, creating a normative climate. When you talk about authenticity of free speech, you change the value of the speech from a bad thing to a good thing. Free speech is a good thing. Authenticity is a good thing. And so at least it's somewhat reduces the negative perception of the speech, which makes the world a happier, safer place to say racist, sexist, anti-religionist things. So I want to thank you. I want to thank SPSSI. SPSSI gave us a little bit of money to pay our MTurk people, and so did the Jack Brown Memorial Fund. So thank you. Yes, please.
Very quick question. So you mentioned that it wasn't the role of self-threat. So did you have any measures about group threat?
The answer to that is never did. It's a really great question, and I'm going to write it down as soon as I get down. But we really believed in the individual threat idea, so that's why we did those studies. We were wrong. If we had thought of group threat, we would have been much smarter, and I would have a better answer for you. But maybe in the future, the real question is, when you say something racist, to what extent do you think you're defending white people and their power, or men, or whatever, or Christians, or Western, or whatever? I don't have an answer for that. That's a really good question.
You mentioned it's the need to create space for this public
Yes.
creating that space only probably for one group of people, because I don't think people would see authentic when they will say things about, other stuff. So
That's right.
they motivated.
Yeah, it's built into our explanation, the in-group process, because presumably we are looking at people who have animus towards an out-group in our cases. So it's not a self-hatred model. So we just glossed over that, but I think we won't in the future. Thank you. Yeah, next. I really can't hear you very well.
A very short question though.
Okay.
Short. Yeah.
Alternative idea. Maybe it is justification for the social hierarchy, or for that matter, the values that society should have.
Right. So the comment is maybe it's for this grander protecting the world, the white dominant Western patriarchal male world, or the hierarchies that they exist. I think it's less likely to be that because of the high specificity of the correlation between the attitude we measure and the defense. We're looking at 45s, 47s. I think it's probably not general, but it tends to be specific. But let's talk about it afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So I want to begin by saying what a thrill to be in the symposium, so fascinating. And we continue our theme of addressing depressing topics after looking at inequality and authoritarianism and growing defense of prejudice. We're now going to look at how democracy itself can be seen as under threat. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on the paper, Emma Thomas, Catherine Amiot, and Vitaly Moghadam, and in particular, Vitaly's work, which he explores in a series of books, those of you that know him, and most recently, Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty, but a whole host of relevant books that we looked at as we were developing the program of research. And the idea here is that although many people might think of democracy and dictatorship as quite separate and be confident that they live in a democracy or that perhaps they live in a repressive regime, in fact, they are along a continuum, and at any moment, the society can be seen as strengthening or weakening in its democracy. And they shift towards one end of the spectrum or another based on predictable processes. Ali argued that democracy and the transition to democracy in particular are fragile because they need both macro and micro level change to occur at the same time. And the macro level change requires rare pro-social dictators or leaders who are attaining and harvesting political capital to build institutions like the judiciary and schools that support democracy at the same time as they're opposed by elites that would rather keep the power for themselves. Simultaneously, citizens have to have what Ali thinks of as skills, I might call them norms or attitudes, about constraining elites. So they have to be prepared not to give the leaders a free rein, but to keep them always on the hook, including religious leaders, political leaders, all kinds of different authorities. And Ali argues citizens have to be able to question sacred beliefs, understand those who are different, adhere to principles of right and wrong, and so on. He's got a list. So what we were looking at in the grant was about activism, but the context for that study was a kind of growing concern in the authorship team, but also in other scholars, about the strength of democracy around the world. Some of you know this brilliant paper by Munk and Foa, 2016, where they were looking at the World Values Survey. And what we're seeing on the y-axis there is the proportion of respondents that agree it's essential to live in a democracy. And what we're seeing in teeny letters on the x-axis is the age of the respondents. And what we can see in a variety of countries, the United States, the Netherlands, Sweden, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, that if you're sort of in your 40s, 50s, if you're my age kind of thing, yeah, you think it's essential to live in a democracy. But the midpoint of the scale here is the midpoint of the y-axis. So what you can see is that for young people, not only do a majority of them not agree that a democracy is essential, but sometimes we're talking less than a third that value democracy. And that's important because, of course, around the world and historically, democracies are comparatively rare. So there are free democracies in green and partly free democracies in yellow, but there's a lot of purple on the graph in Russia and China and Africa where people are repressed in the sense of shooting people when they disagree with you. Now, this black for the United States is because the authors were riffing about the Trump world and not because you're seen as a black hole, right? So that's open to question. That's what the authors of the graphic were saying when they showed this, not that it's the worst of all worlds. So with my students, we wrote a chapter about building group norms and group identities into Vitaly Moghadam's model, but also we were in the middle of a grant that Ali was on, which was looking at how the success and failure of collective action affects activist future tactics and support for democracy. And because I, like my co-authors in the symposium, are prone to run late, I'm just going to give you the answer to that now so that I don't get lost in the data and the stats. So let's begin by saying when collective action fails, I'm going to show you some data that activists do radicalize as that happens, but also that they can change their support for democracy. And I'm going to start talking about some of the ways in which they do and don't change. I'll begin by highlighting the great work of Steve Wright. There he is there, who put forward the definitions of collective action that many of us have used ever since, that actions that are collective are designed to benefit the group. And that can include things like signing a petition that you might do individually. But I also want to introduce a distinction between conventional and radical action. Conventional action that's common or normative according to the advantage group, and radical action that's more unusual or non-normative according to the advantage group. Now, why do we focus on the view of the authorities? It's because almost by definition, if the activists are doing something radical, they themselves support it. Their group supports that radical action. But what they're doing is choosing to do something that the broader society and the authorities might stand against. And the reason why we are interested in this for our grant is that there is a large body of literature that has started to look at what will motivate people to take collective action. And we often use the Ben Zommeren et al. Model there, that collective action is predicted by having strong social identities, norms, a sense of efficacy and anger, and lately moral conviction. Ben Zommeren's been looking at that. And there's also a beginning body of literature that looks at what predicts radical action in general. So there's some good work by Tausch and again by Steve Wright. But what there wasn't was really a lot of work looking at what happens when people have taken collective action and they experience feedback on that. You know, many of us are activists. I am one myself. You go to a lot of rallies and they often don't work. How does that change your tactics? What happens next? So we put forward a model which we call DIME, as in the 10-cent piece in Canada and the US, and the expression stop on a dime or turn on a dime. And what we're really looking at is what would change people's engaging in collective action. And we had the idea there might be some simple learning processes. So for example, people might start off with conventional tactics, like they're going to sign a petition or go to a rally. And if that works, you know what, they're going to keep doing it. But what happens if they don't work? At this point, we thought we might see three completely different processes occur that to some extent mask each other in the public space. One is that a large group of the activists is just going to say, well, that sucks, I'm going home now. They're going to disidentify with the group and they're going to exit. There might be other people, though, that have the opposite reaction, especially if they're strongly identified as activists or committed to the group. They might have a moralization and energization. What does that mean? A growing sense of moral urgency. You know, we tried it, it's not working, we got to try harder. And the items we use to measure energization are literally things like we must redouble our efforts. We've got to try even harder to get this through. But that I up there was what in some ways we were quite fascinated by, and that's the idea that people will often respond to the failure of conventional action by looking at what else might work. And that can take them towards creative art or poetry, but it could also take them towards radical forms of tactics. So those are the ideas that we explored in a series of studies, and we are presenting using an experimental paradigm that I now will describe. So an important aspect of this work is that we're using convenient samples of students or online panels like MTurk, but in each case we pre-screened the panels so that only people that identified with the cause that we were studying were allowed to participate in the study. So if we're looking at an abortion protest, we first would ask, what are your views on abortion? And only people who were pro-choice, for example, would be allowed to continue through to this study. So in each case, we're dealing with sympathizers, not with political opponents or neutral people. So we're talking about how sympathizers who imagine participating in a protest are going to react. And in each case, we dealt with real movements that were relevant at the time. So the movements that we've examined are pro and anti-immigration protests, protests for marriage equality, anti-fracking or coal seam gas protests, and abortion rights. These are some of the students at the bottom of the screen who participate in the research as honor students. In each case, the sympathizers were asked to imagine that they were going to a protest that was conventional or radical. And although we were looking at radical action, these were real actions that were being taken place in the context studied. So for example, a peaceful rally versus a blockade, or a rally or street theater with colorful songs and so on, modeled after the Raging Grannies here in the US. So we didn't look at violence unless that violence had occurred in the context, and that's important to note. And then we looked at the protest succeeding or failing. Now, some of you will be thinking, how can you possibly have a plausible manipulation of success or failure for some of these contexts when the real world is so stark? What we're usually looking at is a municipal context. So imagine that your city is taking a stand on this issue that's not in accordance with your views, and then you sway them or not. So just to walk you through an example, this is from an anti-immigration protest. So we already pre-screened people, and we found that these are people that oppose sanctuary cities, and sanctuary cities are American cities that don't cooperate with federal immigration officials. So for example, if in the schools or in the police of the city, the municipal officers will come across someone that's not a legal immigrant, they're meant to notify the federal immigration, but in the sanctuary cities, they don't do that. So these are conservative people that think that's a shame and that they should comply. So we imagine that you're a resident in a sanctuary city, and you, along with a number of residents, are concerned that basically these city officials are putting your group at risk. So action is necessary. And then what you're going to do in this case is you're going to engage in a more radical action by blockading the city hall for 2 hours. So you're going to get the Board of Supervisors to abolish the sanctuary protections. You're going to blockade the government center, circling the building with arm's length, completely blocking all entrance and exit for 2 hours, and so on. And to make a long story short, after this, there's either a press release where the city says, okay, you've made your point. Our county officials will now cooperate with the federal authorities, or there's a defeat. And this is one of a number of studies that I'm now going to show you as a meta-analysis since we are pressed for time. But also, of course, because we have an in-prep paper, which I was hoping would be in press by now, but it's still in prep, looking at the meta-analysis across the studies. So the first point in that first column there, the first point I say, is that what you can see is some support for the idea of those divergent outcomes of failure. Yes, it's true that after a failure experience, many activists become disidentified. They reject the group, and presumably there's a risk that they'll drop out. But in addition, we also see an incompatible increase in energy. So activists who experience failure, presumably a different group of them, are also feeling that you've got to double down on your efforts. You just got to increase your commitment. And finally, activists who experience failure increase their intentions to engage in radical protest. And that is the focal hypothesis that I'm talking about today. Now, we do also show a main effect of the activists' conventional action. We hadn't theorized that, but if the activists start off doing something conventional, the ordinary sympathizers that we sampled, remember convenience samples, they're more likely to identify, less likely to disidentify with that, and they also are less likely to themselves subsequently endorse radical action. So here we can see that how that spiral would develop. Now, for the focal interaction, where the failure of conventional action in particular was supposed to lead to radical action, we get nothing awesome, and indeed no patterns that are consistent across that meta-analysis of the studies. So what I want to do is just cherry pick some of the interactions that I hope you can get a sense of how we're interpreting that failure. So in the anti-fracking case with an American MTurk sample, that first column, what we found was when people were exposed to conventional action, it didn't affect their attitudes and tactics if the conventional action succeeded or failed. But when the radical action failed, they showed lower support for democracy and a trend towards increased lawbreaking. Presumably, we think they were feeling like they've tried everything, the system doesn't work. Now let's contrast that with a marriage equality case in American MTurkers. Again, when the conventional action didn't work, it didn't affect the activists' identification or support for future tactics. But if radical action failed, they disidentified and perceived lower moral energy in that cause. And what we really think is happening here is that the tactics themselves are just less acceptable in that context of marriage equality, which is certainly true if you're following that campaigns. So the idea is you have to have a threshold of legitimacy for radical action to avoid having that turnoff effect. And then last, in the anti-immigration sanctuary city MTurk protest that we looked at, here we found that the radical action overall had little impact on the participants, the activists. But when conventional action failed, that failure led to more innovation and lawbreaking and lower personal support for democracy. And I guess what we're reflecting as a grant team after we've done that first set of studies, the big studies, is that the moderators in the social context that identify whether the radical tactics are legitimate is really what's going to impact on that failure, because the appraisal of failure in activist context is super contested. What does it mean, for example, if there's a big rally and then President Trump refuses to budge, or there's a big rally and your governor refuses to act? Is that a defeat in a war, or is that just one battle in the long path to victory? So I think that's where we're headed next. But let me just skip forward and talk a little bit about support for democracy. We measured it in the ALI's model in two senses, the personal support for democratic values, but also political agreement, which really looks a lot like the authoritarianism measures. So one point to make, I'm just gonna pick out a few studies, is that they're really highly correlated, the personal values that you have and your support for democratic institutions and minority rights. In addition, the means are relatively high. So if we look down in those columns, it's a scale from 1 to 9, but they're not as high as I thought they would be. So on a scale from 1 to 9, the mean agreement with democratic values is in that 6-7 range rather than say 8. Thanks, Jolanda. But the other point that I want to talk to you about today is how support for democracy correlates with some other variables that we looked at, the DIME variables in particular. So sorry for this very text-heavy slide, but what you can see in the red there is that, of course, support for democracy correlates with low authoritarianism or right-wing authoritarianism. That's almost a construct validity, right? Because right-wing authoritarianism is what Jolanda was talking about. That's when you need a strong leader. In addition, we did see some trends that left-wing orientation was associated with support for democracy, and we could talk about that. But what I want to highlight here in the blue is this positive association that activist behaviors and identities show with support for democracy. Because I think there's sometimes a rhetoric that activists, are working against the system and so on. But what we can see in that blue is that in general, the more you're engaging in conventional action, the less that you, so the more moral urgency that you might feel for a cause, the more you're supporting democracy. So activists are engaged in democratic activities, not undermining them. I mean, if we look at these correlations. So where am I going with this? Well, I want to come back to it first and just say when we do pull out those radical intentions, of course, it's important to say that radical action sometimes is of value, and I would never dispute that. But the literature tends to see it as a problem. And if we look at that literature, some of the factors that you would have seen are, for example, that young men are more predisposed to engage in more extreme forms of activism. We don't find that trend in our community samples. There are weak trends with age in lower radical intentions, but no consistency and few are significant. In addition, there is often an association between or the perception that more conservative people might be more willing to support the system. We find that more conservative people are less likely to engage in radical action for left-wing causes. But when we look at conservatives' intention to engage in radical action for right-wing causes, then we can get a positive trend and certainly no consistent effects. So I think that's another important point to make. And the last point that I want to make is that although the political and the demographic predictors are incredibly inconsistent, what you do see across the studies is a strong pattern of association with the group process variables. Its radical intentions form in radical groups, and its identification with those groups, the moral urgency of the context, the energization, and so on, that is associated with those radical intentions forming. So overall, we did find that failure radicalizes at the same time as it can lead people to drop out, and it can lead other people to double down on their efforts. So these divergent paths. We find as well, unexpectedly, that conventional action can be associated with energy and ID, at least in a community sample. And we also find that the learning model that we had put forward, where people just simply switch tactics every time that tactic fails, is not justified consistently. Important moderators appear to be operating that will change those activist reactions, which of course makes sense. I just want to finish with this theoretical point that puts our work in the context of the work from political science and sociology on radicalizing states. So I think that this data highlights the degree to which authorities have a lever, which they don't often talk about or which isn't covered in the media, in terms of the radicalizing patterns of activists. I think that the association between failure and radical tactics is mirrored in the world context. And what we can see in this particular figure is a model from political science by a researcher called Crandall. And what he has argued is that activists and authorities move in lockstep up a continuum from democracy to dictatorship, that in the democratic context, authorities respond to protest by engaging in politics. But then as the democracy starts to falter, authorities respond to what they're positioning as subversion with coercive surveillance and intelligence monitoring. And then finally, as the democracy is completely broken down, protest is criminalized, protest is repressed through state terrorism in extreme forms of militarist violence, police violence. And in that context, of course, activists will often be engaging in violence as well, which can be labeled insurgencies in revolution or terrorism. And similar ideas have been put forward by Pratt in sociology, co-radicalization, and by Ali Moghadam in his 2018 book on mutual radicalization. So then we can ask ourselves, where are we in our societies? And of course, the impetus for this talk is that both in the US and in Australia and in Europe and in Asia, we don't seem to be at the healthy end of the continuum. We're seeing authorities that are criminalizing dissent and protesters that are withdrawing their failure for their support for democracy and seeing, especially the young people, democracy as a failure. So we do probably need to think about that in our work and in our behavior. And I'm going to close there, and I'll mention to you that I'm very happy to send the slides of the talk to anyone. I encourage you to contact me, and you'll find other resources from my lab and my students at socialchangelab.net. Thank you. How many minutes do I have for questions? We're supposed to finish at 1:45. Okay, we've got 5 minutes for questions. Woohoo! And if you want to make a dart for the coffee, we would be the last person to stop you. Yes?
So have you given thought to what kind of moderators are that determine?
Yes, and I guess, yeah, one point I want to make, which I'll just scroll forward to, is that for a social identity researcher, the most obvious thing that you would think would moderate would be activist identification or identification with the activist group. And of course, pre-measured activist identification is associated with everything in the world. Like the more you identify as an activist, the more likely you are to innovate, moralize, be energetic. I was a bit surprised that activists are actually more likely to engage in radical intentions. But as we say, there's also that strong support for democracy there. But what is interesting is that there are no consistent interactions of pre-measured activist ID. So it's not the exploratory variable that we thought. In that context, then, I think what we need to look at is the attributions for the failure. And in particular, one of the big avenues that our team is looking at is that contestation of failure. What are your expectations of the event? A long time ago, in a paper with Matthew Hornsey, my colleagues and I were looking at how experienced activists see most rallies as a context for building an oppositional movement, but naive protesters think that the rally is designed to take effect. That is, it's supposed to do something, and if it doesn't do it, it's going to fail. Another paper that I had with Lita Blackwood looked at activists in the peace movement before and after the Iraq War. What we found was that if you were an inexperienced activist, after the country you were in went into the war, you tended to see that as a failure of the movement. Now, I think many of us would agree with that appraisal, but what's fascinating is experienced peace activists didn't see it that way. When you look at their failure perceptions, they were completely constant before and after. And I guess that's partly because they expected the country to go into the war. They knew it wouldn't work in the short term. They're there for the long term. And so that's the kind of thinking that we're trying to get to, is that idea of kind of battle versus war. And we looked at repeated failure in recent studies, as well as looking at how activists are actively contesting failure. And now that we've looked for it, of course, we find it that activists rarely agree that anything is a failure. They're looking on the bright side, right? Okay, yeah, in the back. Yeah. 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 In general, we expect allies to be wimpier than people in the disadvantaged group, but it's an empirical question, right? And you could argue that if the repression is extreme enough, allies might be emboldened, right? Disadvantaged group members might be the ones who are like, right, I'm not putting my head up because I think they'll shoot me. And allies might be the only ones that would act in that failure context. So I think that there's going to be a U-shaped curve, but we haven't tested it experimentally, where at moderate levels of failure and repression, allies drop out because they're wimps, or put it differently, they may not be as highly identified. There may be other attractive identities that they can flow back to. And perhaps there might be some interesting effect at very high levels of oppression, where allies might be disproportionately emboldened in that dark context to step out. But it's an empirical question that I think deserves to be asked. I would love to see that done. That work would be great. Yeah, that's right. And of course, the families of those people they're separated from would on the one hand be so despairingly willing to act, and on the other hand so disempowered, right? Are you telling me that we need to end? Okay, I'd like you to join with me in thanking my colleagues for a brilliant symposium, as well as Cindy for putting on the webinar. And I hope you will come and chat with us if you would like to, or meet us in the coffee room. Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to introduce myself, Lauren.
Oh, Lauren, hi.
Nice to
I feel
see
like
you.
I should hug you.
I know, really.
I mean, we've